Greetings, y'all.
Evening.
Hello, everyone.
Good evening.
Brian, I'm showing that you're muted. I cannot hear you.
There we go. Thanks. There we go. Not sure how that happens. I should not be muted, definitely. Okay. So Josh asks how prevalent brigandine spalders were. We'll get to that when we get to the 15th century section. Not a problem, BJ. We see you there on text. We'll wait 2 or 3 minutes before we start here. Oop, let him in. Hello. That's what happens. Okay.
So I caught the tail end of your answer to the question, but I got my audio to work right.
Yeah. Don't worry about it. We'll do it in the 15th century section.
Sounds good.
Now the trick is to admit the person, but not also hit mute for me. Apparently it's easy to do. Okay. There we go. All right, we have a majority of Schola and ex-Schola folks, although we're getting some SCA folks as well. Wait another minute and a half or so.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey there, Ed.
Going.
We do have intermittent storms moving through the area, so hopefully I won't lose power. It doesn't usually happen, but it can. So if it does, we'll reschedule. But we're going to press on as if that's not going to happen. You all seeing the PowerPoint screen, the splash screen? Good, okay, great. So what I'm gonna do today is we're gonna start off and take you through a bunch of the primary source references. So surviving pieces and manuscript references for Armour. We'll start a little earlier than 1350, probably 1330 or so. And then bring it up. In each section, we'll have essentially some artistic references and then some surviving examples and then some modern reproductions. Hoping to sort of calibrate folks towards the original pieces rather than the copies, even though the copies might look pretty cool. I've got some copies here or some, in the style of pieces here that we'll look at as we go. Feel free to punch questions through the chat while we're going. Or I'm not sure I've got the raise hand thing working, but I'll watch periodically and see. And you'll see every 3 or 4 slides, I'll pause, see if anybody has questions. Feel free to throw them in there if I haven't noticed just some other way. All right. Okay, any questions before we begin? Okay, well, welcome. We're going to cover kind of a broad period here. 9,000 slides, not quite that many, but lots of pictures on the slides to talk about. We did not get them sort of animated in the way I wanted to, sort of ran short of time, but that's all right, we'll talk through them anyway. So we're going to basically go through this timeline. So we're going to talk very briefly about the age of mail, 10th century to 1350 or so, then the transitional period where they're moving towards plate. And then in the plate era, we'll break it down into really 4 areas. Spend a fair amount of time on the Italian, some time on the German, then a very brief amount of time on the last 2, the sort of alla tedesca, which for those of you Italian speakers means after the Germans. It's Italian armor done in the German style. And then we'll look at one slide only of the sort of English and Flemish stuff. That traditionally is not well covered in the literature because it's more of a recent sort of exploration point. And we'll look at Tobias Capwell's piece on there as a way to sort of jumpstart that. So we're going to go through the whole period here. As I said, we're going to look at reproductions and original pieces here. These should be good, useful for anything from SCA to HEMA to Harnish Vecten, or to a lesser degree, perhaps, the sort of ACL rebated steel stuff. But we can talk about modifications that are necessary to make the stuff work for whatever your application is as we go. So I always like to start out research with the secondary sources, the key ones. My focus on there's not really a key one, but the other ones up there, this center one, Claude Blair's European Armour, that's really the book to start with. If you only get one book on it, well, it'll probably be Arms and Armor of the Medieval Knight. But your second book should probably be Medieval Armor by Claude Blair. It's done in 1957, but the text is very readable. It doesn't have tons of pictures like a coffee table book or like this red one does, but it's still the foundational cornerstone text. It's still current enough that not much that's written in there has been supplanted. And Blair was active for many, many years in the UK sort of armor and European armor scene, as sort of a senior doyen. So that's a really good book to have if you can find it. I found it in the past for about $10, and I've also seen it for as much as $100, so somewhere in there. Arms and Armor of the Medieval Knight came out, I think, in '86 or '87. David Edge, who's the conservator at the Wallace Collection in London, and John Miles Paddock, his co-writer. That is a fantastic first book because A, you can usually find it for $20 or less, and B, it's festooned with pictures, including a lot of color shots. So that's a great place to start. Like a lot of these books that have pictures, though, I think a lot of the community suffers from looking at the pictures and not reading the text. These are really good books to actually, both of these, to actually go through the text on the period you're interested in. And it'll really set you up with a lot more knowledge than I can convey here in an hour. So we'll try to, I would point you towards those 2 as the main 2. These 6 books down here, it's really 5 plus Armor Sales by Sir Guy Laking. He was a early 20th century scholar. These are less current in terms of what's believed to be accurate, but there's still quite a bit in them that's worthwhile. And you can find digital copies of them for free over on archive.org because they're out of copyright. So these you can find on archive.org. Sir Guy Laking is the name of those. I'll pull from that a little bit. And then this one by Alan Williams, if you ever find this for less than a couple $100, I might break the bank to try and get that one because it retailed for about $800. Fortunately, I reviewed the thing, so I got it for free. But it's fantastic. It actually does metallurgical analysis on armor from the 14th century all the way up through the 17th. And so he'll tell you how pieces were formed in terms of what the metallurgical evidence is. So these are all secondary sources, and mine sort of covers some of the technical stuff. There are no books on armor making really, except for mine. Hopefully that'll change sometime in the future, but right now that's kind of what we're looking at for secondary sources. Obviously today, we've got a lot of different armor forums and whatnot, but I would approach those with a little bit of caution. Certainly, you know, engage there and whatnot, but there's a lot of sort of internet expertise over there. It's not quite grounded in authenticity. So use them, but don't rely solely on those. Always check it with these sources. All right. So like most things in sort of history, we want to go back and look at the primary sources. And this is partially to avoid the Xerox problem where you're copying a copy of a copy of a copy. That's very common in the SCA, and it's been sort of catapulted by the Fighter's Handbook and so on, that talks about ways that people way back in the late 60s and early 70s made armor before we had all this information. So we've done generations of generations on copy and copy. Fortunately, there are a lot of surviving collections in Europe, and many of those collections have both websites and catalogs. The catalogs generally have far more information in them than you're going to find on the web. We'll talk about some of these. For example, this one, the Armory of Castle Coburg, from Austria or Northern Italy, depending upon what era it's in, has weights for all the pieces that are in there. That's very hard to find. What none of them have, which is unfortunate, but this book by Lionel Boccia, also hard to find. There may be some pirated copies out there. I don't advocate that, but there might be. It was printed in '82. The Shurberg book, pretty hard. War, the 1920s version, still tough to find. And there's a new series of books by Hans Pruner, a publisher, I believe they're in Italy or Austria, and they are producing very vibrantly photographed collection books. These are fantastic. They're not cheap, but they're amazing. I did not clip any prints except for the next one on from their books because they're all in copyright because of photography. So, but there are some collections in the US, since most of us are in the US. If you ever get a chance to get to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, that is amazing. The Keenbush collection in Philadelphia, another amazing collection. And there are a few smaller ones, the Art Institute of Chicago. There's a small museum in Cleveland. There used to be the Higgins Armory in Worcester, Massachusetts, but that sadly is gone. There's still a catalog, but so far that's what we've got. So using these catalog books and using the sort of museum websites and whatnot, you can actually go back and look at the originals. And I would say whenever you're commissioning a piece or starting to make a piece, go back and look at the original one. I try to make as many prints or photographs as I can and then put it up on the wall so that I can try to refine my eye while I'm working on struggling with the hammer and making it look like that. It does help if you're looking at that shape. It also helps to some degree if you go look at other things that were created during the period, for example, architecture, painting, that sort of stuff. And so that's what we're going to sort of rely on for primary sources. Anyone have any questions about sources? All right, we're going to blow through then. Okay, oh, I did have one more slide on sources. Edition here, and Pruner, this is the level of quality you can expect in a Pruner book. I mean, it's amazing, the control of light and shadow and the detail that they pull out of these high-res photographs. Far different than you'll see on some of the ones from the 20s and whatnot. But they don't have a lot of detail in terms of the piece's weight or composition or thickness or anything of that sort. So these are great as sort of surveys to see the images from a couple different perspectives and some unusual angles sometimes. But you really need the original catalogs to go deeper.
Hey, Brian?
Yeah.
I have a question about original sources.
Sure, go for it.
How often, so I get that you're looking at examples of armor that has survived. How often are we studying things like tapestries and, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the term for the carving on top of a grave.
Yeah, Gassant is that term. Yeah. Obviously, you're going to see a bunch of those as we go through the presentation. Iconographic sources are the second most common one. The caution you have to put when you're looking at iconographic sources are two things. One, the accuracy of the artist, just how good were they? And that's can be an issue. And two, how representative is the thing that they're depicting? So there's a fantastic altarpiece called the Isenheim Altarpiece that has a bassinet with a grill on it. Looks pretty much like ours, except that ours have a border. That's kind of where it came from. But that doesn't mean that grilled bassinets were common. And we don't, because there's only one example, we don't really know how common that sort of thing was. So you have to look at artistic convention at the time. You know, sometimes they just depicted things in certain ways, particularly on brasses and funeral effigies and things of that sort. That can be an issue. But if you can triangulate that with other sources, you can start to actually get higher confidence. I'm glad you asked the question, because that's particularly important in the 14th century where there are a lot fewer surviving pieces. When we get into the 15th century, we have a larger body. In the 16th and 17th century, we have tons. That doesn't help us out too much in the 14th. Another complicating factor is that because armor collecting was popular in the 19th century and into the early 20th, there are a fair number of forgeries out there. And those sometimes look close to right, and sometimes they're wildly off. Sometimes I play a game, I'll put up a series of helmet pictures and say, okay, which one is actually the fake? We're not gonna do that today, but as you start to refine your eye, it's a good sort of game to play. When I was in Florence looking at some armor that an antique dealer was selling, he went into the back, pulled out of a safe a bassinet, and tried to convince Robert Holland and I that it was real. Well, there were like 4 things on it that made it abundantly clear that it wasn't real, but it was aged, the holes were punched out. I mean, that if you didn't really know, you might actually fall for it. When I asked him what the cost was, he said 10,000 euros. And I almost lost it and snickered on the site. It was clearly not worth that much. And then we sort of, exchanged glances, and then he went immediately to the phone, picked it up and said something about bassinetto falso. So either he's annoyed that we called it a fake or it was a fake. We don't know which. I didn't buy it, obviously. I didn't take pictures of it either. But you'll find those can be an issue too. So we'll look at some sources that pan sort of the spectrum. Another source that is less useful in terms of line are literary sources. There hasn't been as much work done with things like inventory records. Part of that's made difficult by the fact that most academics don't care about this stuff. And secondly, the terms that were used are either super precise, so that may be the only instance of a term where we see it, or it might be that, for example, they call the whole arm harness a braccio or something. So we don't actually have any idea what it looked like. And you can also look in literature and so on. You got to watch out for translation problems there, but we're going to stick mostly with visual sources for this. If we're talking about, the industry that the armorers put in, we may do another class on that later. That we need to rely more on the written sources than we do the visual ones. But for now, we're going to stick with the visual ones. Good question, though. Thanks, Ed. Any other questions on sources? All right. Oh, just back to the, I don't know if I can go back. Let's see. I can do it without screwing up the whole screen. Okay. This bassinet, by the way, is actually the pig nose from the Shurberg collection. So it's the famous Shurberg number 13. It's one of the few that survives that actually has the Latin Latten, so meaning a copper alloy. It looks brass, but there was no standardization. It could be some mix of copper, tin, and or zinc. Could be somewhere between brass and bronze, we don't really know. Normally you just say copper alloy, or Latin, Latten is the medieval word for it. This piece up here is not actually brass. It's actually steel, and then it's been washed. So it's kind of an interesting piece. Very finely shaped though. You can see some of the details. This eye slot that we usually make straight in their copy is actually brought up a little bit and then turned over. Not completely closing the edge, but reinforcing that critically weak point. You don't see that on any of the other pictures because the detail is just not there. This is also a reason that if you actually get to go visit these places, that's exceptionally cool. Another particularly weird thing on this one, notice how this piece is just sitting over the top. Could be a repair, or it could be, it was like that originally. Most of them are not like that, so I would tend to say repair, but we don't actually know. This is one of the very few bassinets that still has the correct visor with the helmet. Very often these things were changed out during their service life, so just because it has it on there today does not mean that it was on there originally. All right, so, and this is your question, Ed, right on iconography and so on. So these are sources at various levels of quality. So if you look at this one with the fellow in full plate, this is a pretty good rendition, comparing it to actually surviving harnesses of a mid-15th century Italian, North Italian sort of suit with the armée and the jousting reinforce or the war reinforce, the giant pauldron sitting over the shoulder. You can see he doesn't even look like he has a rear brace on under that. And then a jousting reinforce here, mitten gauntlet with this sort of single plate going into it, and then the two-piece Milanese cuirass. So a good source, and you can find sources like this that will help. Notable on Milanese, notice there's no sabatone in the foot. The Italians didn't put those on there. They used mail or nothing. Now, the Germans did use complete sabatones though. Over here, you have a bunch of figures shown using spears. This kind of dovetails their spear class pretty well, because they're doing exactly what we say in that class. But you can see these clap visor bassinets. They're clap visors on this guy because he's got a central hinge. It almost looks like a strap, but I don't think it is. Typically theirs didn't have straps. It's probably the Avant Ale attachment, although it's possible it was a strap. If so, that'd be the first one I've ever seen. And then this fellow has a very strange hook nose kind of side mount. And the question on a forum was, well, how realistic are these? Because none of these survive. If you did find one like this, like the one in the green circle, you'd probably assume that that was a fake of some sort, because there's a number of things that are wrong about it. And so this is what I mean by the quality of the art and how accurately it actually depicts the piece. During the 15th century, that sharpens up considerably, but in the 14th and earlier, it's sometimes very generic and hard to tell. Also, we'll see funerary brasses and whatnot. We'll look at a few of those as we go. Okay, so talking through the age of mail, this is going to be pretty much the Viking Age all the way up through the first third of the 14th century. And what you're looking at here primarily is going to be, so cap-a-pied male, all up and down. This fellow does not appear to have any reinforces, although there could be something at the knee, depending upon how you look at that. There's first reinforces we see from male. You'll see that his great helm up here with the lady handing him the helmet and his pennant and his spear and all that, or his lance rather, is ready to go. He's got the fully enclosed hands, mittens, and then this coif might be integral to the whole hauberk. That was sometimes done. And then these chausses appear to be male also, although they might be spring or some, or scales or something. During the early part of the 13th century, they started to add reinforces, first in kerboili, boiled leather, and later in iron, particularly at the shins first. Anybody have any idea why you might do the shins before anything else? Seems odd, doesn't it?
Getting smacked in the shin sucks.
It does, but there's probably more reason than that. Good start, though.
Keep it from hurting the horse.
Well, hurting the horse, but if you figure you're fighting footmen too, your shin's down there, and there's very difficult to get a sword down there to cover it. So my guess is that neither your shield nor your sword really cover that, and so that's the first thing that you cover. I think BJ hit it. You're on a horse and some peasant will stab you. Yeah, that's basically it. So I think that's what we're talking about here, and that's why it starts at the shins. There are a lot of Italian effigies. I didn't put a lot of them on here, but where they show sort of what's clearly carved leather. Now, if you see those in the 13th century and the early 14th century, it's not, you know, fancy reposade steel in the form of lions' heads and stuff. It's almost certainly kerboili. The sort of animal-shaped armor and stuff didn't start till the 16th century. So they did it in Rome a little bit, but they didn't do it at all in the medieval period until the 16th century. This fellow in the middle might surprise you. He actually dates from 1270, and you can see in his coat here, I think this is from Magdeburg Cathedral, you can see his plates sewn into the surcoat for reinforcing on the body. So, or not sewn, they're probably riveted in. Looks like there's little dots there, so those would be rivets. He's still got his helmet with this different colored visor. It might be that that raises and lowers. It's possible. I mean, the central hinge maybe. I don't know. It would clap. That was probably where the word clap visor comes from as you rode. His coif is probably behind his head. He's pushed it back, and everything else looks the same. So this sort of rendition of full mail, you'll find, of course, in this period, very large shields, because the mail by itself, I mean, it stops cuts, but it doesn't do a lot against crushing. So, and if you read Romance literature, you'll find what I tend to call the myriad blows fighting technique, where they're hitting each other over and over and over again. They're not cutting things off usually, unless you manage a full charge with the horse and drive right through, because it's very difficult to cut through mail. But you can crush the bones under mail with no problem at all. So reinforcing it makes a certain amount of sense as soon as the sort of billets of iron become available. And the technology for that may have been part of the reason for the delay, but also we may be looking at the changes that come from the stirrup and the canted lance, the lance canted under the arm and whatnot. As soon as you're not holding it up in the upper arm anymore, maybe you need more reinforcement on the body and the head. So that's a possibility there. This fellow is at the very dawn of the 13th century, maybe 1310 or the 14th century, 1310 or so. And you can see now he's wearing mail, but he's got a few pieces. He's got the little plate. It's obviously an iron cap here, and it would be iron. This period, we don't get steel in any ready sense until the early 15th century. There is some in the late 14th, but it's not readily available. And then over the back of his head, you can see thrown a sugar loaf. This is kind of unusual because he's not wearing a chapelle de fer under the sugar loaf, but it does happen occasionally. And then the shield size, as plate goes up, shield size goes down. So very rarely do you find guys in plate with large shields unless they're at a tournament or unless they're archers using it as a defense. And that changes by period, but you can see the sword is still kind of balanced between cutting and thrusting here, with the emphasis definitely being on cutting still, or striking, I would say, not cutting. And so this is what you're going to get as we enter into our period, with selective areas where you're starting to add zones here where you're reinforcing. And the reason that didn't catch on faster, as I say, it's not clear to scholars why that is, but I posit three things. One, the non-availability of large billets of iron. Mail, anyone can do anywhere. Two, you've got some changes in fighting technique that also bring about the greater need for personal body defense. As we get into the 14th century, archery obviously becomes a bigger issue during the 100 Years' War. And as soon as that becomes a factor, you'll start to see pointed pig noses and things of that sort, designed to keep the arrows and the lance head, for that matter, off. Now, if you're in this pot helmet sort of thing, how do you think that'd be to fight in? Anybody fought in one of those? It was actually the first helmet I fought in was one like that.
I fought in one of those.
How was it?
It was fun. They take blows right to the top of the head very well.
They really do, and the side of the head especially. Yeah, the one that I fought in was deeply caved in on the left side, probably more than an inch or two. And the thing was probably 3 inches from my head, padded with open cell foam that 800 people had borrowed before me. So there was, the scents in there were kind of exciting. But yeah, it's bulletproof though. I mean, I never got hurt in that thing. It's just not really, the vision of course is very, very little, because the ocularium, the eye slot, is pretty far from your eyes. And so you don't see a lot. So it's an equestrian helmet. You probably wouldn't do that on the, on horseback. Robert Wirtz says he wore one for years and then made another one later. I fought in a Pembridge style helmet for a while too. You'll see one of those later with even narrower eye slot. I think Andrew's got one of those, as does, I think it's just Andrew here that has one of those. The eye slot on those is pretty narrow too, and also far away. Both cavalry helmets. That's right, Bernadette has one also. And they have some relationship. You can sort of see the pointed top starting to come into mode, as opposed to this big sort of round tin can thing. And you're going to see that very quickly, rapidly evolve. Most authentic armor's plates are not flat and just curved, the way we see a lot in the SCA or some of these other groups. They're almost always complex curves to get the points to bounce off and go in different directions. This is one of the, when they first started off, that was not so much the case, but that didn't last very long. It's pretty quick that we start shaping the plates. So here's some more things from the sort of transitional era, from 1330 to 1350. Over with the fellow with the Lex on his shield, got the big shield, mail. You can start to see though, under here you see some, and it's not clear whether that's iron or whether that's Kerboily, could be either one. Eric's heads are the bulbous heads for artistic flair or evidence of heavily padded coifs. Do you mean on the previous one, on this one? Probably they are heavily padded, because you don't really have much under this. Sometimes you've got a cerviliere, you'll see that as we get into the next picture. But yeah, the padded coifs on this, you'll sometimes see a round kind of, almost like the torse, but on the inside of the helmet in this period. Yeah, drawing heads is hard, that's true too. But you'll see them wear it inside, and some people made up the padded coifs and they've got sort of the cap around the top for this sort of helmet and for the Sugarloaf. They don't live with that for very long. Some people now, for example, wear coifs under their bassinets just to keep their hair out of their eyes and such in the sweat. Sort of a similar thing. But no, it's probably because you do need more between your head and this thing. They obviously wouldn't have used 3 inches of open cell foam to pad there. So that's most likely the way they were doing it. Good question. Okay, so you can see on this Lex fellow, big shield and mail, and then you start to see some reinforces here on the arm and such. This fellow dates from, I think, about 1340. This is a not so well off guy. You see this helmet form, this what they called the iron hat or the chapelle de fer. Very common, particularly amongst English armies, but also in the French. For your lower level knights and squires and so on, men-at-arms would often be wearing these things. And of course, it doesn't take too much imagination to squint and see British World War I helmets. It didn't actually change a whole lot. The design works pretty well. The broad brim not only keeps the sun off, but if a weapon is coming down at you, you can actually tilt your head a little bit and keep part of the weapon face off of you, which is, you don't really realize that unless you tried fighting in it. This fellow, of course, isn't lucky enough to have any gauntlets, so whatever hits his hand, hits his hand. One of the reasons in Schola we target the hand nicely, but it's a valid target is because of that. But it's also very difficult to armor the hand. We're going to see a lot of different whacks at trying to do that. Those of you that have bought gauntlets have figured that out. It's pretty tough to find a pair of gauntlets you like and work well. Of course, the more money you had historically, the better off you'd be. These two figures in the middle are from the Manesse Codex, 1304 to 1340, begun in 1304, It's like it was finished sometime around 1340. These fellows are much more like 1304, but they do show guys on foot. Unusually, they show one fellow cleaving the other one right through the helmet. So there's a lot of debate about this because Romance has that in it as well. A lot of these scenes are tournament scenes they're showing in Manessa. He's wearing a crest, for example. That's not exceptionally common in war. It's more of a tournament thing. But because these helmets in this era were iron, and you may have had some better quality steel in the sword, you might actually see this a little bit. It probably wasn't very common, and most likely you would have had some flaw in the piece to do that. But anybody that's ever worked any steel, trying to put, that much sword through that much plate would be extremely difficult, particularly on foot. It'd be hard. On a lance point, coming in the 15th century, if you had a piece that was over heat treated and brittle, yeah, I can see that going right through. And they didn't really have the scientific testing we have, so they didn't know whether the piece was proof against the full power or not. So this is possible, but it's probably not common. It could also be a literary thing. Look how powerful this guy is. He's smashing this guy, and they're sort of using literary, sort of visual exaggeration. That's possible too. A nice thing on these, you get to see a little bit of the shield mount. Should look pretty familiar to most folks who are trying to match them up in an SCA context. Then you get over here to this fellow on my right. Now he's got, he's closer to 1350, died in 1380, but probably 1350, 1360, they're still wearing this. The German peoples tended to fall a little bit behind the Italians and the French in terms of what they were wearing. So sometimes, like this guy died in 1380, and yet this armor is nowhere near 1380, 1360 maybe. That doesn't mean they weren't wearing it in 1380, but it was, Europe has sort of passed this era by 1380. But you do see kind of a surcoat outside of it that you could well be hiding a coat of plates underneath. We'll look at coats of plate in a minute. And then he's got studded leg harness here. And it's not clear what those studs are. It could be that's fabric covering over a piece of iron. Could be that that's kerboilie with studs on it. No way to tell. These knees are probably iron or brass, or Latin rather, because this shape is really hard to get in leather. It's possible though that they're leather and they're gilded or something. That's possible. And that's part of the problem we have with artistic stuff, is just figuring out what's what. Oh, go back. There we go. Okay, so this bassinet that he's wearing up here is very thin. It's more like what's called a cerveliere, kind of a cap underneath. And so the male part of a coif was replaced during the first half of the 14th century with this steel cap. And then the coif was attached to it using vervels and cords, sometimes just riveted straight through it. And this is what you'll find worn under most great helmets in the 14th century. So this guy probably had a helm somewhere else. Maybe he's kneeling on it, or it was back here, or it was left off the artistic piece that he would then wear when he goes into combat. So this is the genesis of the bassinet is this cerveliere worn underneath the great helmet. Okay, any questions on the pre-plate stuff that we're looking at here?
Hey, Ryan,
Yeah.
Coloration of his mail, I mean, was that kind of Latin or brass-colored mail common, or would that be more artistic flair?
Yeah, well, it's because his helmet's that color too. I'm not sure. I would tend to say that you could wash iron in some kind of gilded thing, or it could just be trying to indicate saintliness or something. It's hard to tell. Yeah, his waist is thin also. The 14th century, that's an ideal, although in the mid 14th century, so it's probably half artistic and half, that's the way the breastplates are. One of the benefits of a Globos breastplate is it sort of makes you look that way to some degree.
I'd say if you look at the pictures of like Reese Nelson, the pursuing the
Sure.
guys, I mean, they look very wasp-waisted when you see him.
Definitely. And but in terms of this being gold washed, probably it wouldn't have been Latin. It's possible, but Latin is so much softer than iron. I don't know what benefit you'd get out of it, but washing it might make some sense. It makes more sense to me though that it's probably just trying to glorify the person they're making the effigy for. But if you find numerous examples, and I would say if you're doing a reenactment and you wanted to wash your mail in gold in some fashion, you could do it. I mean, there's some evidence of that. It's loose evidence, but it's still there. All right, let's go ahead and go on then to sort of mid 14th century as we start to get armor up. So now we're looking at coats of plate become common. We're very, very lucky that in August of 1361, there was a battle on the island of Gotland, where a bunch of defenders from this walled town, the town of Visby, were called out to battle. Unfortunately, it was all young men and young and old men, like kids, like 13, 14, and old men. The bulk of their fighting force had gone off to fight somewhere else, and the attackers took advantage of it and came in. And so they sallied forth from the city and were utterly slaughtered. The only reason we know anything about this, except from some minor references, is that it was extremely hot in that August, and the bodies were laying out in the sun, and the defenders wouldn't capitulate. So the attackers said, fine, you're not going to get to bury the bodies until you capitulate. Well, 3 days went by. You can imagine what the bodies were like at the end of 3 days. So they very rapidly dug a hole right there and just poured the bodies in. Normally, they would pull as much of the armor off as possible, but a lot of this armor was fastened to either leather or cloth, and that's going to be soaked full of bodily fluids. So they just left a lot of it in there, and they just dumped it in. Equally, fortunately, was that it was a peat bog that it was being dumped into. And so because of that, we have preservation. And so in the 1920s, Bengt Thordeman and his crew did an amazing excavation of this site and found tons, somewhere up in the 50 range, of different brigandine styles. No two are the same. So they're all different. These are not brigandines, I'm sorry, I misspoke. These are coats of plate. So, and from that, they did reconstructions. This is one from the original book. We republished this thing in 2000 or so because we found it so valuable and it was impossible to get copies. Inside these are full pattern sort of layouts of the thing. The original has it and our copy has it. This is the fellow that was buried with his male coif intact and just thrown in. There are some other skulls from Visby that show sort of weapon damage and stuff. That's sort of food for another class maybe. But you can see the little shoulder pieces hooked on here, just a little bit of defense right here at where the shoulder would be. But this is pretty good defense. And these coats of plate have been extremely popular in the SCA and elsewhere for 40, almost 50 years now. These things are incredibly durable and easy to make. Typically though, they attach at the back, which most people don't like. So they'll tend to make them attach on the side or in the front. Don't do the front, but on the side you can sort of get away with. I've never found a problem having somebody lace somebody into the coat of plates, and realistically you can reach around and just pop the thing loose and take it off yourself. You just need help getting into it. These are fantastic. You can make these at home. You could sew this out of canvas, and these plates are just bent in one direction. So pretty simple. There's tons of sources online, and you can follow the plates then and pull out the pattern, make the pattern up to you, and then go. And you got instant body armor. I think these sell for $300 to $500 today, but you could make it at home for probably $40 and a bunch of hours, but not difficult and fun. Usually it's one of the pieces I would start my squares off with first, making that piece in the shop. This one is actually very nice. It's actually been edged to sort of finish off the cloth. Very commonly they're made in leather. This is a US manufacturer. It's easy to find. So these things were pretty useful, but they still present a big flat surface here. And of course, flat surfaces to lances and whatnot aren't going to be great for turning the edge. So, yeah, Robert says they started one of these painter's drop cloth. Yeah, you can do that exactly right now in roofing nails. I just pointed one of our new guys at that exact thing here in Wetumpka, one of our cash challenged guys, because you can do it for $10 for the drop cloth, $5 for the nails, and you know, whatever people want to use for the plates. So yeah, and the roofing nails work great for this. Josh asks about the double hauberk. Yeah, there are other sources for that. Sometimes it might be that you had to reinforce in the front. They're all literary sources though. We don't have any that I know of iconographic sources for that. But it could be that it's a double, that it's just a second layer sort of laced into place or even stitched into place. So this is another piece that comes from Visby. Obviously the full piece is a reconstruction from Best Armor in Czech Republic. But this is the original. You can see the amazing fidelity left on this thing. And still pieces, you know, this deeply dished thumb, which is better than a lot of guys make them now, giving you a little bit of thumb cup, 4 little gatlings on the fingertips, and then the tips for the gauntlets. All this is the basis for most things that you'll see online today, as Visby gauntlets come from this collection. From a practical standpoint, they are maintenance queens because this leather tends to tear, but they're pretty protective back in here. But depending on what you're doing, obviously you need to do better on the fingers usually. The tendency buying from overseas is that they don't put leather under the plates, or if they do, it's thin leather and they don't add any felt. So I've always found that 2 to 4 layers of felt is necessary under these to make them really resilient. And certain kingdoms have SCA rules that forbid them altogether. So check with your local martial art source for that. But I actually really like these because they're extraordinarily protective. They're not as restrictive in the wrist area as an hourglass could be, although you shouldn't be breaking the wrist in hourglass gauntlets anyway. But so these are kind of neat. They look simple, but they are not. They take a considerable amount of time and they're very tricky to get just right. And I've probably seen 5 or 6 pairs that I thought were really, really right in terms of reproductions. But we do get those from Visby, and this is 1350 to 1360. You might have seen these all the way up to 1400 though, because something that was done up this nicely probably wouldn't have been thrown away. They would have used it as long as possible. And the essential defense, you know, some sort of scales over the overlapping scales over the fingers with gatlings and tips is pretty common throughout the 14th century. So this wouldn't have been a deficit in any way, except for maintenance. So if you're the squire, or you know, you're the man at arms that owns it, you'd be doing a fair amount of stitching. But it's still worth it. These are good stuff. Any questions on Visby? Go ahead, Ed.
I've got a question on how protective are these, given that the it doesn't look like any of the scales would ground out on the weapon. So it looks like you could easily sort of crush the fingers.
Yeah, that ground out thing is kind of an SCA thing. Historic ones didn't do that at all. Typically, the way it works is the plates overlap and they transmit some of the force from one plate to the next. And then if you have absorbent material of some kind underneath, it'll actually absorb some of the shock. I fought for years without them grounding out. And it's possible to break a finger in those. You know, when I started doing WMA stuff, I did it less. But I fought pole arm and spear with them for years. Typically, if you're thinking, you know, I'm going to be doing a lot of Schola stuff or whatnot, a finger buckler worn over the fingers solves most of that. Not all of it, but most of it. Certainly nothing's going to be as protective as a mitten, which is why we eventually engineered the mittens. And you'll see some Italian mittens in here later on that are much simpler. So you're gaining mobility here, but you're going to give up some protection over the fingers in particular. There's no way around that really. So it's just a choice combatants make, you know, making the call however you like. Any other questions on Visby? All right. So you see the same arrangement on this brass here with the Cervelier bassinet, and then held on with revels, and then the Avant Ale, which is, this is a leather strip, of course, and the mail is stitched to that usually. Sometimes the rings go straight through the leather, sometimes it's stitched. And that is, you can see where it's taking the place of the coif, but he now has iron spalders here, or spodlers, and then over that would go a great helmet like this, like the one BJ and Andrew have, Pembridge style. You know, we get them, we don't have this stuff underneath typically, so we just put them straight on. Over the top of this is often worn that sort of cloth torse, which may be where it comes from even on later period helmets, sort of tradition carried forward of that, because this thing is obviously not going to sit easily on that. So you put the cloth torse on there, and then you put this helmet over it, and you're ready to go. These are for chains, and you can wear it slung over the back. There's a reproduction later on that we'll look at where it's worn exactly like that. And there are a lot of references to these things being painted. This is a sort of interpretation, modern interpretation one by Best Armor. But I think the painting or interpretation is particularly nice. It actually preserves it against rust and also looks all strack and heraldic and stuff. So a nice way to sort of bounce it up. The 14th century is famous for sort of a lot of heraldic expression. All the brass effigies and stuff are full of it. And those things were originally not white or alabaster, but they were painted like churches were. So you would have seen brilliant colors on these things in the initial period, which may go a little ways towards answering that question about that gold colored mail we saw earlier. Maybe that was just the painting they did to make it look good. So we're going to enter here into the sort of the second half of the 14th century. Now we could spend an entire class on this without any effort at all, several hours going through illustrations. So I just picked a few that we can look at to give sort of a representative sample. So here you see a very similar sort of bassinet, but now you've got, this is still the guy's nose, not an actual nasal, but now you've got some weird things. You've got some scale going down the back to protect the neck. This guy's got a breastplate and folds. You guys have seen my version of that I have. He's got hourglass gauntlets on. So now what's happening is they're supplanting and reinforcing all the male areas with plate. One question that comes up really often is, whoops, whoa, come back. Is he wearing a full male shirt under there, or is it, you know, like I've got on here, sort of a skirt and then just the segments up top? Probably until 1380 or 90, it was always a full shirt. My guess is full shirts were worn all the way up into the 1420s or 30s by some people, while others went with partial defenses. So the evidence is not clear one way or the other. You can see in this next effigy over, there's clearly male here and male here, but we don't know beyond that. This is clearly plate. It's not leather now. His bassinet is pretty solid. There's no great helm here. So the face opening has gotten smaller, and I don't see any hinges here, but there could have been staples here or some sort of central visor. There probably was originally. You see his hourglass gauntlets are not terribly belled here, but they are there. Could be artistic convention also. And then the arm now articulates really long rear braces, goes all the way up into the spodler, and then it comes down with only one little lame here and then the elbow. Notice how deeply domed these elbows are. As soon as we get articulations, the elbows have to be deeply domed. One of the errors that's made very frequently in SCA contexts is they're much too flat, and they don't really give the full movement as a result, so you need two lames. If they're deep enough, you don't need two lames. You can just do it with the one. Coming back to this guy for a second, there's some unusual things in here. He's got scales on his feet. It's possible that's just his interpretation of male. It's also possible it's scales. He's got some primitive sort of leg harness here, so he doesn't have articulations here. He doesn't really have articulations here, but he's got what's clearly a vambrace here enclosed on the outside and possibly on the inside, probably on the inside. That could also be his, no, it's pretty much, that's going to be the armor. Andrew asked if there's surviving examples of scale. No, there are some effigies, but there's no, to my knowledge, there's no surviving bits. There's individual scales that survive, but we don't actually have a scale shirt or an Avant Ale. We've got a couple effigies of that. There's a fellow in France that's making up some really cool scale sabatons attached to medieval shoes that are slick, pulling them off of effigies. That's all we've got, unfortunately, for that. Eric asks if a male shirt under a cuirass would be additional protection from missiles. Yes, at the joints, but probably you're not too worried about missiles going through a globose breastplate, because this shape is such that almost always your arrows and such are going to bounce off it. Now, lances might not, and on a globose breastplate like this, probably you're not going to worry about crushing with a sword or a mace even or anything like that, but a lance point you might. And so that could be an issue there, to answer your question on that one.
Hey, Brian.
Yep.
If folks haven't seen it, Todd's workshop about 6 months ago did an awesome demonstration showing arrows like deflecting off of a globose breastplate.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I usually treat the studies with some caution because the metallurgy has to be the same, but the deflection principle is clearly there. And if you can go, if you want to go find that one, it's important. And that's why, you know, some people will see a flat breastplate and say, oh, that's what mine looks like. So yeah, that globose shape is actually pretty important, and it's kind of hard to get. This is deeply domed. You'll see when we look at Shurberg how domed this really is. Yeah, it also hides if he's fat, but it's pretty deeply domed. And I've taken a lance point on a globose breastplate, and it does seem to just bounce right off. So certainly if you're really worried about it, you might wear a male shirt under it. In Shurberg breastplate, you'll see they've got a male shirt under the whole thing, or they might not in the picture we have, but probably that's the way it was worn initially. See on the picture of the left, how far to the bottom of the breastplate articulated. Usually these globose breastplates go just a little ways below the short rib. So you're looking where you bend is where that thing's supposed to break. And you know, the bend point is different on men and women. So if you were making it for women, you'd probably adjust that some, but typically it'll go, the bottom fall, this one is probably stationary, but all the rest of these probably move. So you're talking about the layered bit under the breastplate. Yeah, these are the folds. These aren't actually under the breastplate. They're probably attached to the breastplate. So I've seen combatants in an SCA context do a breastplate like this and then make a scale set of hip protection My first squire just loved mail. He was a mail maker first, so he was bound and determined that he was going to wear mail. And so we got him into a coat of plates, and he made up a mail skirt, and he wore it, and he took a blow right on the hip, and he figured out the mail didn't actually stop much from a club at all. A fall does a lot more, but it doesn't attach beneath, it actually attaches to the breastplate. So you're going to see that it's, if you look on mine, I don't really have it accessible, but it's actually, the whole thing is attached in one piece. So the breastplate stops at the mid body, and he may be wearing a backplate. I've done this with a brigandine backplate, or an iron breastplate. Can look pretty sharp. And I've also done these with a brigandine set of tassets down here for lady combatants, especially since their hips are prominent in that area. So it's good to have the armor. It also gives you the more wasp-waisted look. But there's only a few effigies that show that, and I don't actually copy them here. Notice also his expensive knightly belt here. I have a theory that those are actually your one of your methods of ransom, that you simply take that sucker off and hand it to the person who's ransoming. I have no way to prove that as yet, but I don't know what other purpose it might serve, particularly when they're, you know, solid silver bullion or something of that sort. We don't know what they were made of because we don't have a lot of records, but go ahead.
On the belts, I see that these seem to be below the, you know, the widest point of the hips. So are they not actually sitting on the hips? Are they pointed to something?
They might be. We typically, mine will sit right on the hip. And if it's on a fold, it isn't going anywhere. This is below the fold though. And that, my guess is that's an artistic slip, although you never know. He might have pointed it to that area. I get suspicious when things like the helmets are so accurate, the hourglass are going, and then one thing looks like it's wildly off. It could be they just didn't have one to look at, or it could be that that's what they were doing. Because none of those belts survive, not a single one, we don't really know. And so that's where the experimental archaeology gets to come on. You get to try it and see what it looks like. Yeah, this guy's is also equally low. But this, you know, penultimate sort of, these are metal belts. So you can see all the Gothic tracery, that's very common. And they're not sword belts, they're kind of belts that signify rank or wealth, perhaps. On this guy, now you see a full plate leg harness and the nice sharp crease all the way down the center. That's what you want to see. He's also got, as the fellow next to him does, the sabatones going down here, so full plate sabatones. And then the jupon sits very likely over his breastplate. And there's a huge debate over this. This could also be a lighter coat that he's wearing over the armor. Could be the coat armor, but you can see a little bit of cut here at the armpit, which is coincidentally exactly where a breastplate is cut. It's also where the arming point and the gambeson is usually cut at that point, because you want the same flex for the arms. But this has buttons down the front, and so most people call that a jupon, not a gambeson, because it's being worn on the outside. Guys that have experimented with these have tried multiple layers and found they get a lot of extra protection from that. So it's possible he wears this and not mail under that instead of mail. That's something that's been kicked around. You can see the mail clearly depicted on his bassinet, but we're pretty late now, because now the bassinet, we'll look at the bassinets in more detail in a minute. It's no longer center mount with a center hinge, but now it's affixed at the sides up here. Notice there's no strap around it. That's kind of an SCA thing and WMA thing that we've done, but because we have a lot of lawyers. But you probably want this thing to be quickly raisable in the event of getting unhorsed, or you just close into close combat. Anybody that's fought with a pig nose with a very small ocular knows that in close, it can be something of an exciting time, because you don't see much below you, and your field of vision is not that great. And because the earlier period, they weren't using visors at all, it may be that this was just an extra bit of defense that you used when the lances and arrows were coming in. Then once you closed, you'd raise or even throw off the visor. These almost always have quick release pins here that you can pull it off and just throw it, get rid of it. So that's one thing that feeds that. Finally, you've got over here a German effigy from 1390, right at the end of the period. I mentioned that Germans tend to lag behind until the mid-15th century. And here you've got a bassinet with a center mount. He's got kind of a houppelon thing that he's wearing underneath his breastplate here. The breastplate has falds. Now this one almost looks like they do come under the breastplate. It's possible. This is where we're wrestling with the skill of the artisan, and we have to try to find 3 or 4 more copies or interpretations to see if maybe there is some evidence for that. Then, if you really think it might be the case, you have an armorer try it out, see if they can make it work. This would be pretty tricky to do, but it would be possible because the cast and burst and to some degree, some of the later German stuff kind of works like this. So it's possible that was what was going on. Very stylized gauntlets though. So, and very simple sort of knee and leg protection. But what you are seeing is the implementation of some fighting clothing along with this thing, these Hupalandi type sleeves that are popular. You can also see he's got a male shirt on underneath it, so probably not a big thick jupon like this fellow has. This guy, by the way, probably has an arm harness on under the jupon, which is why you have little buttons at the outside of the jupon, because you could never get it on over an arm harness unless you're able to button it from the outside. So we're going to keep talking about transitional stuff. Feel free to keep asking questions about it. This is a classic one, of course, the Black Prince tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. If you get a chance to see this, this is amazing in person. This is all gold wash, or was. It's done in bronze and then gold washed, very rare. Usually they're made out of marble. But exquisite detail in the stuff. And in fact, we have high confidence in everything that's shown because these are the gauntlets that are shown in the effigy, and the real gauntlets survive. They were hung over the effigy and they're still there. This helmet matches up with this helm, which is hanging above his thing. This is actually the leather and gesso crest that was put on the thing. And then his original parade shield here. So you've got a shield made out of wooden planks with gesso that's just before it hardens up. They shape it into these shapes and then paint it and gild it. So this is the full effigy. You can see he's wearing a jupon, so he's got something probably under this, some sort of breastplate or cuirass. And then he's got a full arm harness, single point articulations, classically English sort of, or Flemish elbows. And then the finger gauntlets you were asking about earlier. Clearly he's not putting anything over these. And the bassinet with the helm under it. So the Black Prince was active. This date is not, this is not him at all. That's on there from the previous slide. Sorry about that. He was active in the third quarter of the 14th century. So this is what you're looking at is high-end armor during the third quarter of the century. But this is a phenomenal surviving piece. We don't have really much else like this in the 14th century. There's the Chartres Cathedral segments of armor that survive in the 14th century, and then Visby, or not Visby, I'm sorry, Shurberg. And you'll see a few of those pieces here, but that's a lot of what we've got. Now this is the famous Shurberg 13. In this image, it does not have a male shirt with it. Originally, it would have been definitely worn with a male shirt. These gauntlets are not actually with it. This is another set. The von Matches had two of these, or the von Trapps, I'm sorry, had two of these sets of gauntlets. We've got good records of their armor collection extending back to the 15th century. So this set actually belongs with this harness. We know because this Latin inscription matches the inscription on the helmet and the breastplate. This is actually in the Bargello collection, also in Florence. And this is in Schloss Schurberg, the castle. This belt is original from the 14th century. These gauntlets would have had fingers attached. If we had a closer up shot, you could see they would have been attached from this rivet point. These were very likely holding on cloth. So these may have been covered in some sort, all of these pieces might have been covered in velvet or something originally. I haven't seen anybody actually do that except with the gauntlets, and they covered them with leather, but judging by 15th century Italian stuff, they may well have used a sort of rough velvet instead. We don't know, but it might have looked amazing. I mean, it looks amazing the way they are now. One thing about this breastplate is that these pieces are all attached on an internal set of leathers and canvas. So these pieces collapse right into each other. And this one doesn't go in as far as I make them now. I actually pull this in a little bit more because people want to usually pull their armor over, especially lady combatants who have more up here. They actually want that to come across so they don't get as much bruising at the side. This is cut very short. That's pretty common though. Where you might actually have an inch or so below the bend in the waist. And that's pretty typical for the very end, 1380, 1390, 1400, somewhere in there. Yes, Brian has a set pretty close to this. My breastplate is like this. I've still got arms that are pretty much exactly this. In fact, the first spring steel pieces I made were done for these, and they weighed literally half what my old 16th century or old 16 gauge set of arms weighed. I don't really feel them at all when I'm wearing them. I'd like to see that. Yeah, if we ever find a picture of the velvet cover stuff, it'd be nice to see. It would have been tricky to cover the visor though. It's possible, and there's brass on it, so we don't really know. I'd like to see how they did it, if they did do it. These visors you can see on this one's got a center mount here, so it's towards the end of the spectrum. Sharply pointed bassinet. As the time went on, the bassinets got pointier and pointier. My guess is that's an artifact from the manufacturing technique. I strongly suspect that a lot of these were actually forge welded cones, and they started from the cone and then raised out the rest of the piece. There's another school of thought that says they were raised from the inside, like the big water wheel that still survives. In Italy, it's possible that was done too, but there's no reason to draw up this point then. So we don't really know. If you raise this in one piece from a flat sheet, it takes a lot of hammering to get it in there. And if you form it from the inside the way a water wheel will, it's going to end up with a very rounded shape in here. And then you have to turn it over and pull all this up raising wise. Possible though. Pretty nice mail on here. Sometimes we have lots of effigies that show that they weren't necessarily covered in padding, and they didn't always cover padding, though sometimes they did. More in Germany in the East than in the West, but it was done in the West as well. So this is the famous Shurberg number 13 harness. You can see a very subtle cant to the eyes and the mouth. Armorers often miss that when they're trying to do it. Also notice that the breaths are only on this side, not on this side. That's deliberate because, of course, most of your lance passes are going to be hitting on this side. BJ asks if it's hard to defend the back. You would want something else. He would probably just have mail. When I do this in an SCA or an SSG context, I like using a brigandine backplate that sort of matches or sets off with the gambeson, sort of continue the heraldic color scheme up. And that's then an optional piece. You can also do that with a globose breastplate, just like this. This is what's meant by a globose breastplate. It's very globy and very sort of rounded in here. All right, so bassinets themselves, they start off more rounded with the central mount like this. This one up here from Coburg, sort of an intermediate style, very common in the German areas. You'll see a lot of effigies bearing these with a center mount and sort of this pointed snouted, we sometimes call today a pig snout visor. These are typically referred to by antiquarians as hoonskulls. These are typically called pig noses, but those aren't really medieval terms. That's sort of modern collector language. This bassinet is an extraordinarily fine one that was in Shurberg initially. It's called the Lisle bassinet. Oh, I'm sorry, it was not in Shurberg. This is a Lisle bassinet, and this is now in the Royal Armories. I've actually handled this piece. It's very, very brilliantly put together. It's not clear though if this visor goes with this helmet. Might have been set back further if it had the right bassinet visor on it. But nonetheless, it has a really good line to it. This male Avant Ale is probably the finest one I've seen. The links on this are about 3/16 of an inch. They are tiny and thin, and the thing is really light, super supple. So this is an extraordinarily expensive bassinet that you'll be looking at, all white finished. I believe that when Alan Williams did the metallography on this one, that the visor itself might be low carbon spring, and this might be iron. Don't quote me on that though, I'd have to go back and look at it again. Typically helmets in this era are iron, and they're typically a little thicker than later periods because they're trying to compensate for the lack of steel. They don't really have access to steel as much in this earlier period, at least not big enough billets before the blast forge comes into use, blast furnace. But these things can be, this one's almost an 1/8 inch thick in the front. So it's much like a 12 gauge bassinet that we might produce for the SCA today. I am not a fan of making light helmets because I think the weight is part of the protection of the helmet. And happily, these are fairly heavy. So these weigh about the same as my regular ones, somewhere in the 8-pound range. And then you add the Avant Ale on top of that. So the bassinets are going to come through. You've got a little picture up here of how the Avant Ales are attached, no matter what shape. This is called a brevel. This would be usually, this is leather. Some people have tried brass with that, but usually it seems to have been leather. The Lisle bassinet has leather, and these are Latin or brass Avant Ales. This little wiggle work on here is done with a little graver, and you just literally wiggle it back and forth to get the shape. So pretty cool little simple way that you can, if you can get a graver and learn the technique, you can easily come up with, it's just 2 little sets of loops that interweave. So pretty nice stuff. Any questions on the bassinets or the piece we talked about in the last frame, helmets? All right.
Yeah, actually, I got one. Looking at the Shurberg helmet in the previous slide, is there damage to the bottom of the visor? It kind of looked like a funky shape. Yeah.
Maybe I didn't see that one. I haven't been personally see this one, but it's not caved in any significant way. I think that's just the light. But that is a place where you might expect some crunching if you picked up a lance point there or something. Because there's nothing really reinforcing that, it's just the edge. And the mail does not attach to that, of course, it closes over the mail. But I don't remember this being crunched in at all, so I don't think so. Good question, though.
Okay. Yeah. Also, I wanted to note on the Pembridge helm you showed earlier, the dent right over the left eyebrow.
Yeah, yeah. There she is. Yep, right there. Right where you'd expect it to be. Yeah. And some of the Visby attacks also, there's been some studies that show that basically the shots were coming in war, at least, not from the guy in front of you, but from the guy over, just like we teach. That's where you're getting hit from. But in jousting, as you have this helmet on for, whether it be tournament joust or war joust, that's where you're going to catch it. Better there, though, than down here. So at least here it'll bounce a little bit. Josh, you can go find pictures of the Kerber bassinet. There's tons of pictures of it online. Just be sure you're actually looking at the real one, not one of the 9 trillion copies. Because the real one is something special. There are actually images of it in the Shurberg book from the inside. And Shurberg number 14 actually has a surviving bassinet liner. It's pretty cool. I think 15 might have one too. So through Shurberg, through the helmets. Okay.
Hey, Brian, I had a question real quick on the Hun skull.
Sure.
It seems like it doesn't really protect the sides of the lower jaw. Is there any thoughts on why they would do that versus, adding more plate there?
Let's go back here. See if I can do it without losing the, here we go. So on the sitting one here.
Yes.
Yeah, they were probably, this would have just been mail. It's possible they would have tied something there, but I don't think so. Yeah, it's just, that design didn't survive very long. It is also possible, Ed, that visor doesn't go with that helmet. But they popped that on later.
Okay. Because it looks like it kind of interferes with the Vervel almost a little bit.
Yeah, it does look like that. And this is the problem with bassinets in particular, is that there was a lot of restoration work done, trying to make a finished looking piece from components. And so we don't have good records for that. And this could well be one of the pieces. I've got one, the bassinet I've got behind me here, this one. If you look at the first illustration, it's in the Royal Armouries. If you look at the first illustration of this thing, it's actually got a side mount. The center mount was actually taken off and they put a side mount on it so it fit the helmet they had it attached to. It looked awful. And then later, the Royal Armouries went and made a center mount and attached it back. So it pays, there's a lot of sources from the 19th century and stuff. There's also a lot of sort of hokey stuff out there. So sometimes that may be one of those instances, Ed, where I think you might be looking at a mismatch. The other thing to look at is where this hook is here. It doesn't look like it hooks into anything, just kind of there. So my suspicion would be they don't actually go together. Probably this would be a much small, bring the visor over more, would be my guess. Because you saw that in some of the circular faced ones back here, where sometimes it's coming forward even a little bit. You'll see it sometimes even come into this area and then down. But we don't really know because they cover up here with mail, so it's hard to tell. But you can see some guys have it coming in. So good question. So some of the padded elements here, this is the Charles the Bold from the Musée des Beaux-Arts. It's the best picture I've seen of the thing. Very, very heavy. This thing is meant to be sort of armor in its own right, which is why they call it a coat armor, but it's also could function as a gambeson. Now these sleeves are big and like they are on Walter von Hohenklingen here. So probably what you're looking at is this is a jupon worn outside rather than a gambeson. Nice big buttons. Those are actually nice for not coming out under fire. And then this on von Hohenklingen here, you can actually see the padding. He's got padding outside the Avant Ale as well. It's not universal. Sometimes they have it. And he's got a painted or enameled piece with his device on it here, most likely painted. And then the normal traditional full leg harness. And you can see his little clap visor up here has been reproduced. It's upside down, but you can see it. And this little piece would connect right up in here. And then you can see almost the suggestion of the shape up here where it lives. So this is pretty typical for 1400, 1390 to 1410. As I mentioned, the Germans tended to stick with this style a lot longer than people in England, France, or Italy did. And so you see it on German effigies illustrated way late sometimes. Notice also down here his helmet, his jousting helm, take the visor off, pop the helmet on. The early helmets probably were dual use that way. So, and then his little shield here. So the gambesons in this period are typically fairly heavy, supporting all of this plate. And you've got a new thing coming in, a pour point, which is either a gambeson cut close to the body and the hips so that it snugs up, because you want this whole thing to really rest tightly around your waist. And that's what the steel leg harness attaches to. I have a theory that fitted garments, Edward III started the trend for fitted garments in England when he came back from Cressy. And that was exactly the time when plate leg harnesses were coming into vogue. And my theory is that you needed a fitted garment to actually hold up the plate leg harness. Even if you have it supported from a greave, it's still helpful to have it cinched up here in the hip area. But in the SCA, the way we do it with belts, that's not that efficient. I mean, it can work. Now there's sometimes using padded belts, but it seems to be it was a whole garment, either a vest that you wore. And if you look at cutouts of those vests, it looks almost like this piece here, except it's underneath. It's cut exactly where the breastplate would go, giving the arms maximum mobility. And then you would lace the leg harness up here. Alternatively, you lace it through on the pour point if it's snugly fit at the hips. If it's not snugly fit at the hips, it does not work. So that's kind of this has been a point of interest and exploration and debate amongst reenactors. And I think the Europeans have done a lot of really fine work in the last 10, 15 years at doing some very high-end reconstructions of this stuff. They started out behind us, but now they're ahead of us on some of these things. So this is a great piece. There are more pictures of this available online. You can go look at it in some detail. One thing that's not clear in the gambesons is that the arm sets in pretty much at the same cuirass line, and there's a little dart in the back, and that gives you the full arm mobility. So when you raise your arm up, you should actually have no movement down here in the waist. It should be just straight. And only if it's set in with the grand assiette can that actually happen. This one actually does have it as well. These days, you know, it was impossible to get these things during the 80s, and it was difficult during the 90s. I probably ruined a couple friendships by asking tailors or seamstresses to make them because they really didn't like doing it. But I was adamant that I wanted one that was actually close to correct. So I went through a whole bunch of them trying to get ones that were close to right. Then post 2005, a number of vendors started offering them. So you've got like Quilted Armour in Europe and 1410, both making really nice executions, and a bunch of the Ukrainian guys sort of making ones that are at least passable. And some of these, because of the Bohurt sport or the rebated steel sport, are really nice and tough and heavy, much tougher than the old ones used to be. So now you can actually go out and just buy one made with linen and hemp, or linen and fustian, which is linen and wool cross-woven. Typically, these things were stuffed in tubes rather than quilted down, but we don't know if that was universal. We don't have enough of them to really say. Any questions or comments on these? I actually have a leather one of these that is an absolute total joy to fight in. All right. Okay, so also one on the outside, and sort of like the jupons, they're starting to wear some of these. This is right about 1410, edging into 1420. You've got these guys wearing plate, transitional plate, just like we see with this strange little sort of transitional bassinet. It's almost becoming an armé here with the hourglass gauntlets, but he's wearing a fighting coat. He's got something under his mail here too. We can't really tell. There could be brass at the edge of the mail. I can't really tell in this image. But he's got this fighting coat. And these became very heraldic sometimes. In Italy, they were typically depicted plain, but on armored effigies and stuff, they're shown in a much more heraldic style. And these guys, despite the fact that we think of, you know, by 1420, there's no shields, well, they've got shields and they're using them. They've also, you'll notice just from a power perspective, have these swords canted way, way back. This is not MS 133 where they're, you know, way far forward. They're trying to get every ounce of power they can get out of this. And they're still using swords against armor. So I would object to the idea that swords don't have any power against even plate armor. These guys certainly thought they did. They just needed to hit pretty hard.
Aren't these shields the jousting shields because it's got the notch and stuff in them?
It should be, but they're still fighting with him, right? He's still got it up and is still using it for a ground combat. So my guess is this is like a romance scene or a tournament scene. Okay. Probably not war. But you do see some shields, particularly the further you go in Eastern Europe, the more shields you find. So I'm not sure really why that is. Then you look on this guy's bassinet here, you see the side mount, but now he's got almost an Armour visor on it here. So very transitional type piece. And you'll see images like this in Italy all the way up to 1425, 1430 sometimes. Even though we see pretty much full Milanese at that time, you're also still seeing guys wearing this kind of stuff. And by the mid 1450s, King Rene records that some tournaments that he participated in the 1440s and 1450s, guys were still wearing bassinets with Avant Ales. So you can actually get away with this up to the mid 15th century if you're doing tourneying especially. I think that's the end of the 14th century or the transitional stuff. Any questions on that still? Obviously, we could do a whole class on this, but all right. Okay, so these are guys, modern guys who have been working in the 14th century style just to sort of give a little bit of inspiration for what can be done. This fellow Anton's the one that did our Company of St. George pendants that you saw. It's also a very fine sculptor and jeweler. Most of these guys are from Europe. This is a Schola 2003, ancient now, 17 years ago. Pot arms where we got bassinets and such. And that's Brian Johnson here. And this is Russell Kinder. And some more European guys. You can see the amazing lengths they're going to get the whole image together. One of those scale Avant Ales that you talked about. But just, you know, cap-a-pied with the nice heraldic adornments just makes the tournament actually that much more potent. The Charnay says in his book that, you know, tournament's special because it requires special gear. Well, this is some of the special stuff he's talking about. You know, the idea to present that view on the field. And it really does, if you're doing a high-end power or something, it really does make a lot of difference. And then the third one, just some of us playing around with this. These are pretty old shots. This one, I think, is from 2003 for Brian Johnson's Shurberg 13. And these days, most guys would have riveted mail. And then my transitional stuff that I was wearing in Hawaii for a while. So just, you can actually do a lot with the simple colors and stuff, but you can actually dress it up as well. And the last one, these are models that have been made this is actually not a model, it's probably somebody wearing the thing. But you can see how the cap fits underneath, and then it goes all together with the splinted sort of arms and legs for the earlier period up to 1340 or so. And then the whole thing with the helmet, crest, lance, and shield. So all the pieces. And then here's a guy from the back just showing those crosses, how they can be used to flip the helmet over on your back. Kind of cool. If you were engaged in a battle, you could see taking this thing off and flipping it over your back, just like you'd raise a bassinet visor, almost exactly the same thing. And those visors, if you do them right, should actually lock up, push it up, and it should stay there. Obviously, you can knock it down, but those hinge points are meant to be, you should be able to get it off. So if you're made a pass through the line, you're going to go back, take the sword out, and engage in close combat. You might reach up, take the visor off, and throw it away. And since those,
Brian,
yeah,
can I interrupt you real quick? I just completely lost all my screen. All I have is the picture of all the people. How do I get that back? Do you know? I mean, if not, I don't want to interrupt you. Keep going, but I just lost everything. Okay, all I can see is the people, or I can have like a little tiny screen way up in the corner that's like an inch wide, and that's it.
Try clicking on that one.
I did, but it's only an inch. It's only an inch by an inch and a half.
Oh yeah, I still got.
I'll screw around with it.
I'll be also. We're recording this too, so. Oh, he said look for side-by-side view, so maybe up at the top of the screen.
Now I'm just looking at you.
Up at the top, I think.
Okay,
I don't use as much as a user. Okay, good.
All right, thank you. Got it.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Conrad. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's just give an idea of kind of how it can come out and look, just sort of inspirational stuff. All right, moving on to the transitional between the sort of transition period and the plate period. We've got some good examples of this from Fiore himself, actually showing some of these helmets. You see the round cap with the cheeks coming over. And then here's one on Shurberg 19. I think it's 19. It might be 18. This, I think, is 19. I forgot what number the helmet is. These are both out of the Shurberg collection, though. This one's missing the visor here, and so guys have done various interpretations of what that looks like. This is Armour Moskova's recent interpretation of it. Very comfortable helmet to fight in, very practical sort of thing. My only argument would be here at the male, people tend to buckle that, but it's very hard to get the helmet on if you buckle it. So I would follow the cue that's on a surviving couple of bishop's mantles and just do a brass hook that hooks in. That way you can just pop it off. And should make it easier to get off. Because if you're having some sort of issue and you want to get this off fast, you probably don't want to fiddle with 2 buckles there. But that's been the normal way people have been dealing with it. Now, Fiore's treatises date from somewhere between 1409 and 1420, the giant debate over that too. But this is stuff you'd see starting in about 1410 up to 1430 or so. We don't have a ton of examples from this. Shurberg probably has the best examples, and guys are trying to make reproductions based on that. Because the visor doesn't exist, they're guessing wildly. This is this is how it might have looked in Fiore's time. You also see this unusual little plate down here. A number of Fiore's figures have these some little reinforcing plates, and so there's a whole interesting set of studies to be done on what that actually meant armor-wise. But there's enough interest in HEMA and Fiore generally that a number of the Eastern European armors, especially, have made interpretations of these. There's probably 5 or 6 more that I could show you that are different. I usually clip those things and save them to a directory when I find them, but too much for going through today. But this is, for those of you fighting from Fiore's era, this is what he's sort of depicting here in full plate. So yeah, it's possible, Josh, that it's jousting reinforcement, but he's not using it for jousting. So it's also possible that some guys are wearing those plates, or it's possible the artists are just wrong. I don't know. Because we don't have any corroboration, really, it's hard to tell. Without the corroboration, that's when we make an experimental one and try it and see how it works out. Now, this is a famous painting by Uccello called The Battle or the Rout of San Romano. Highly regarded for its authenticity, and you can see little bits of stuff everywhere. By 1430, you've got your noblemen wearing full plate, and they're marching all over the battlefield here and engage in sort of melee combat. Notably in this battle, if it's not a tournament, it probably is a battle because it commemorates one. You've got crests being worn on the helmets. These are mostly feather crests, not the paper mache sort. Although there are things that are here that are probably brass with gold washing on them, or Latin with gold washing. Then you actually see some guys up in here messing around. You see a guy on the ground here. There are 3 panels to this painting. They're in different collections now, and I've got 3 of them up in my workshop because there's just so much to be learned from these that it's worth looking at over and over again. This shows you what Italian armor by the mid-15th century looked like. So somewhere between 1340 and 1350, you're going to be looking at your better equipped combatants are going to be wearing stuff like this, with the lesser moneyed ones having brigandines and little light cialattas, so sort of versions of this barboot, but shorter with an open face.
Like the guy with the warhammer over here on the right-hand side there in the back.
Yeah, he's getting it on. He's getting ready to go. Definitely, they're not just using a touch, which I like. I use that figure to show exactly that thing, Scott. So I'm right there with you. There's also another frame. This fellow actually has his hand kilted over. So he's throwing a blow with the false edge.
Oh yeah, look at that.
So it's that idea that HEMA guys sometimes have, that was never done. Well, there it is right there. So we don't know how often, of course, but just because it didn't exist in a fighting treatise does not mean they didn't do it. And Italian artists, it does work. And Italian artists had a very keen eye for movement and line. So one thing you might notice about these figures is all the armor is really rounded. We'll look at some actual figures here. I'm going to go off the armored Gauntlets and effigies now because we've got more surviving stuff. There still are some, and they're useful, but we don't have time to go through them all. So here's some classic sort of pieces. This one's a reproduction, the 78 and 79. It's actually 14 inches tall. It's not actually the full piece, but it shows you what a fine set of mid-15th century plate would look like front and back, with a crest and an armée and the whole bit. The suit next to it is by Friedrich, or it's by the Massalians. It's for Friedrich, probably the finest Milanese harness that exists. You're looking at pretty much 1450 to 1460. This is what you're looking at. We're getting right near the end of the Italian period that we're talking about here. Right after this period, the armor styles become very much internationalized, starting by 1490 or 1500 or so. This is what you find in a sort of high-end Italian stuff. And we'll see a picture of Sam in his Milanese gear here in a little bit. Here's some more graphic. This illustration comes from Boccia's manuscript, that one I had on the first page, the green. It's very hard to find, but he's got these beautiful technical drawings that show you just how it's broken out. This is one of the harnesses that's in Mantua that I had the ability to go take apart and take off the stand and look at with Robert Woodsend in 1999. Phenomenal stuff, just picking it up and putting the arm harness on your arm and stuff. Really, really very cool. You can see on this fellow how sort of fitted this stuff really was. I mean, it's shaped to his form and there's no wasted anything in here. But everything is rounded, nothing is flat. Everything has got a little bit of globe to it everywhere. This is the famous Avant armor in Glasgow. This is another example of high Milanese armor. This is composite, made by a lot of different armors. Most armor in this period is going to be composite, so it's going to exist for many different armors. The Italians were specializing, so you'd have a guy that was just making cuirasses, and another guy that was just making shoulders, another guy that was just making arms. It would be boring, but they get really good at it. So unlike today where you're trying to crank out the whole thing and solve all these engineering problems by one guy, they didn't deal with that. The Italians didn't deal with it that way. The Germans did, but the Italians didn't. So you see really only two types of helmets by the mid-15th century in Italy. Really, the Barbuto Soleil. I don't have a lot of good illustrations of the Soleil. It's really just cut down a little shorter. It's like a light bassinet that flares a little at the base. I probably should have got one out of a manuscript for you. There aren't a lot of surviving ones. There are a few. But this Barbuto style is sort of a rediscovery. Of course, humanism is coming back in. The Greek and Roman classicists are being rediscovered. And so that you'll see it show up in the armor design. This, of course, looks a little bit like a Corinthian helmet, and that's not accidental. Notice how rounded the lines are, how humanist the lines are. Italy's sort of emphasizing the human shape, the human form. These plates tend to be a little thicker than on their German counterparts, but they use fewer plates to do the same job. So the weights in the harnesses are pretty similar when you get everything said and done. These two pieces are jousting reinforcers. If you take those off, there's actually a smaller pauldron under there that looks like that and a smaller elbow. So you weren't expected to fight with these all the time necessarily. The one thing that's really wrong on this one is that this gauntlet has been made to match that one. On Italian harnesses, they're almost never the same on the right and the left, and this is usually all done in one nicely flared out piece, whereas this one does articulate like on this one. So this one's probably wrong for the left, but this little simple three-pace construction here, 1, 2, and 3, with a simple wrist, that's a really effective gauntlet for most of the stuff that we do. In an Italian gauntlet, you can find individual pictures of these. It's pretty simple actually to dome this out on the underpiece, dome it out, match it up, put 2 rivets through it, and you got a mitten gauntlet. And I would say this is a good place to start for those of you that are trying to start on doing armor stuff for gauntlets. So this high Milanese thing, you can see the mail under here, but probably it's not a full mail shirt. You don't see it down here. It's probably just like what I'm wearing now, where it's just the mail on top. And you can see evidence of that on this fellow as well. You can see his breastplate. The backplate's really short. It stops here because that's where this placard attaches to. So this breastplate probably stops right about here, right where the short ribs, or even a little above the short ribs, and this placard straps on and comes below it. So you're looking like this initially, and then you add on the falls later. That's a unique Italian thing. And you'll see it's important because when you start looking at the German armor or the alla tedesca armor, they're not making the export armor that way anymore. They're making them sort of like the Germans are, but they still look Italian. So it's kind of interesting mix. The leg harness now, you've got 2 lames typically below the cooter or the pauline here. Big, nice, big, huge wing to protect the inside of the joint. That obviously is intended to keep things off the joint. Sometimes you have mail in there, but not necessarily always. And so a nice wing that covers things, what you're looking for. The staples are here for the joust, the lance rest, but it's not there. And then the one thing I didn't get to check on the harness actually in Mantua was how far these knees actually bend. Oh, there's my mouse, here it is. And that's unfortunate. And the reason I didn't get to check is because they had these actually roofing nailed onto the dummy. So I couldn't take them off. And the number one thing I wanted to check was how far they bent. We didn't get to see. So my guess is they don't quite go as far as we expect them to go in an SCA context, but you probably would be able to kneel though, because I find it hard to believe you put this much money into it and then would not be able to kneel. For one thing, if you were, getting knighted or a prayer or something, you're going to have to kneel. So you're not going to probably squat back on your hips the way we do in an SCA context, but probably at least does a little more than 90 degrees. And so here's some more pieces showing you that top and bottom, and then how the pieces kind of go together. Notice that the strapping has a big, nice decorative rivet on top. These are riveted on. That's probably not right. Probably they were strapped originally. I've never seen that in a piece of art. But at some point, the restoration was probably done that way. And this is the top and the bottom attaching. Everything looks pretty much the same. Notice the stop rib here. And this piece down here, it's hard to tell. There's some little engraving on this edge. These edges here are not round, and they're not just turned up. They're actually rolled into squares or rectangles. So it's actually one, two, three, and then tucked in. And those are actually really fun to do. They're also a nightmare. So it's the last thing you do on the piece before heat treating, and so you kind of hold your breath and hope that you get it right. But it's not too tough. Practice on pieces first, though. Now, if you don't have that much money and you're out there, you're probably wearing a brigandine. So a lot of the guys are wearing these very fitted sort of brigandines. You can see these light soleils. A lot of these are probably Flemish. These brigandines were worn all over Europe, but particularly made in the Low Countries and in Italy, and sold everywhere. And these things, we'll see an example of those. There aren't very many surviving examples of these, certainly none from this sort of mid-15th century period. But you can see that's pretty lightweight. These guys don't have anything on their arms. They're sort of running around. These are archers, admittedly. But nonetheless, even the guys in here who are wearing brigandines still have some arm harness on. So you can actually envision, as we get into the German stuff, a lightweight German arm harness can go with this, and a lightweight leg harness. That would have been what a better off men-at-arms probably would have worn. Okay, so here's some helmets. We'll talk about 15th, Italian helmets first. This is the classic Armour a rondelle. So this is the rondelle on the back. They all would have that, but it's been broken off these other ones. So it's kind of a fun game to play. What does the rondelle actually do? These cheek flaps actually fold up and out. And so it leaves a very thin little strip of metal back there. And my theory is this actually protects that little strip of metal. It's a breakaway piece of armor. So it would bend, this little post would bend and break, but the weak part of the helmet right here, right in the back of your head, would have to be secured. And you notice, remember that guy was throwing that shot around the back of that guy's helmet, and the guy had the warhammer up. In neither case would you want to take that right on that point. So my guess is that's there. The only downside to that theory is this is a spike pointing right at the back of your head. So probably having that thing driven in would be, well, end of story. So my guess is that's probably very loosely riveted in there, or not loosely, but with a very small diameter rivet. So it will break off before it would press through the metal. But that's only my theory. We don't actually know. But you can see the construction. Notice the reinforcing here up at the top. They're deeply concerned about blows exactly where that blow was on that Pembridge helmet. That's where they reinforced the thing. Typically, these things also are thicker on just the skull alone. The skull goes all the way down to roughly here and then over usually, sometimes over back to here. But they're often thicker in the front than they are in the back. So it can be pretty thin by the time you get back to here. Not thin, not paper thin, but something like we might think of like 14 gauge, whereas they might be more like 12 up here. And then these cheeks are lighter. They tend to be more like 14, sometimes 12. But you could take a lot of hits here. So that's a pretty important piece. And it overlaps here by about 3/4 of an inch, and then it overlaps on the back about 3/4 of an inch too. So it's actually attached all the way around, but it does make it a lot easier to get out of an armé than a bassinet. You just flip the visor up, you can pull those pins out and throw it away. You open it up, you've got a lot of vision and breathing to go, and you just pop this thing open and you're completely out of the helmet. Are there big round holes in the top of that? Those are for the crest. So I didn't actually illustrate any of them, but there's one surviving in the Shurberg collection of a post and spring setup that would sit up like this and be sprung attached into the top. And then the crest would sit on top of that. And you'll see this on soleils sometimes and armés as well. This one's actually got two. So you can attach it in two different places. Some of them will sometimes have a plume holder. I don't know if that is one or not. It's pretty rare, but you can sometimes find them. Let's see. And this little bit here, it's hard to see here, but this little reinforced, the very bottom of the screen, holds on, goes over the mail. So instead of using vervels now they're putting a piece of iron over there and just riveting it to the helmet. So your little mail area is permanently attached to the cheeks. There's not as much as on an Avant Ale. Now soleils, the light Italian soleils would look like this velvet colored ones, but they would be a lot most of them wouldn't be velvet covered, obviously, and they wouldn't be as decorative as this is kind of the shape. And then this barbute, this is actually one of a particular style from the Venetian area or Venice, where they would sometimes show lots of guys wearing these. Sometimes they were plain like this. You see it in some of the paintings, and sometimes they covered in velvet like this. More often, this style was plain. And this little set of holes you see here, this is for the liner. It's actually only got a liner in the top of it. Now I have one of these, sort of this guy, and you can see the liner rivets, and then up here, that's all the padding it really has. And if it fits well in your skull, it doesn't actually need more than that. Now your SCA Marshalls may go through the ceiling, so you might have to do it differently if you're using it in that context, but that's historically how they were done. It is also possible, though, that the cap sat in there and this rivet line just went through the lining, and then it actually extended to the bottom. The problem with that is there's nothing holding it on the bottom. That's why I don't think that was done. It is possible to just hung down here like cheap blacks, though. That's a possibility that's been discussed before. I've seen people also put padding here in the cheeks. If we go back to the Armour, whoops. Typically I have padding put in these cheek flaps here as well. So a little piece of padding sewn in here, sewn in on these sides only, not this side. And then it provides a little bit of extra protection in the chin area. So in the, we see it only in the cap here. These are typically, this line of thing shows you where the liner goes. Like I said, I don't think there was usually any lining down here, but it's possible. Now, this from the Hastings manuscript is entitled How a Man Shall Be Armed. This guy's probably going to do a deed of arms, but you can see his partial mail, kind of like I'm wearing now. His mail's being pointed to him. He's tying the leg harness off now. He's got a mail skirt, but not a full shirt. This particular thing, you can find it easily enough online, How a Man Shall Be Armed. It talks about the material that these are supposed to be made of, and then it gives you the order that everything's put on. But you can see these arming jackets now are much smaller and much sleeker because they're really pointing mail to it, and sometimes they're pointing like the arm harness and such to it, and that's it. So it becomes more of a pourpoint than a gambeson. The term pourpoint originated from a garment with a lot of holes in it. And so you can see this one has holes in it that are, well, you can't really see it, but this one has holes in it. They're designed to put different kinds of spoilers and pauldrons on it, depending upon where they actually line up. So you're typically lacing right through to this, and the arm harness would typically lace right through to this too. So did I not somehow? Okay, well, so here's some modern inspirational pieces. This is Tobias Capwell, Dr. Capwell, showing one of his harnesses. He's famous for having a number of harnesses, and as one of his sort of compatriots says, he has a disturbing propensity for changing his armor. Probably most of us would like to have that disturbing propensity, but a full Milanese plate as if it was from 1455 or so. Another fellow on part of the Royal Armoury's jousting, this is Tobias again, but this may be the same harness, in fact, it is, but it shows it with the crest on it and the whole bit. You were asking about that hole in the top. Well, there's what it does. In fact, you can affect this piece of gesso and leather on it, and he's got his little crest on it. So modern day reproductions of it. This is Sam in the Schola Sam. He's just about finished. He was wearing a Soleil with this initially, but now he's got his Armour is in the closing days of finish. So he'll have the whole cap-à-pied, all Milanese. The only caveat is this guy's wearing Sabatones, and that is okay for English and Flemish, which he's trying to be English, so that's perfectly okay. But you can see all the little detailing done on it. This set of arm harness is actually borrowed. He's actually got a full set now, I think. This is the group that was participating, and I threw this in here because one of the uses for these things is what the HEMA guys are calling Harnish Vecten, so going out in full plate from somewhere between 1410 and 1480, and then doing play with poleaxes and rebated swords, primarily using techniques from the fighting treatises. So 90% thrusting, whereas we might think of as a pot arms or something as 90% striking, or the ACL rebated combat guys is no thrusting. These guys are almost all thrusting, not with the poleaxes, of course, but with the swords. So it's kind of the opposite. But it's still a knightly art. It's still one of the relations. So here you've got something that's shown kind of like that early Shurberg one. This one's from a little later, 1430 maybe. Sam's 1450, and this guy would be way back at 1390 or 1400. So they try to equip themselves with axes and such, and fighting with the Halbschwert, and then going out and fighting that way. So that's one use for the plate today. So reproduction armés, they can be very juicy, as you can see. Some really clean lines on these. I actually really like how these look when they're done well. You see a lot of Indian ones that are not done well, but I think they're a tough helmet to get just right, but very, very elegant and extremely practical, just because of the easy little pin here, easy to lift. You can put a hook on it so it doesn't come loose right away. I think Sam's has that. This is Sam's. It's nearing completion now. And this is one made by one of the English armorers. Very fine work though, very clean, very sharp, everything, all the details done on it with the jousting reinforce here. This was beginning what they called a garniture, where you could add plates and then take them off as you needed to. So those guys in the ground we saw wearing brigandines, there's a lot of guys doing those today, and you can easily find vendors making some really nice ones. This is a set of brigandines. This is one that I've got, and then this is one done with the St. George cross. Just beautiful work. Stunningly fit, stunningly apparate. So these are very, very light. Some guys are making these in titanium now. So mine weighs less than my Shurberg breastplate, and our Shurberg breastplate doesn't weigh much. So this, I got mine so I can practice rebated steel stuff in it without destroying my plate harness. It's pretty useful for that. Now, King Rene in the mid-15th century talked about, specialty armor for use in tournaments. And some of this, is his idealized version, but we don't know whether he actually had any of this stuff created or not. That's a little picture of Rene up here. If you followed us through the Pot Arms class, you've seen this already. This is the Great Bassinet, which is another style that was growing up in that mid-15th century. And then the Kerboily cap was put on top of that, and then the crest and torso and mantle all draped on that. Interestingly here, perhaps the wooden baton and the rebated sword. So they're not thrusting at all, they're just fighting with strikes by the mid-15th century. So kind of interesting sidebar as to what tournament stuff might look like. And then the inspiration for that, some guys from the Tenons of Noble Folly, this is way back from the 1990s, using King Rene's the clothing and the Great Bassinets and all to form a tournament team. So they'd actually created 6 Great Bassinets all in the same style and used their existing leg harnesses but put a Rene style tabard on it and to get this sort of look. So it doesn't have to be full plate all the time, but the right plate pieces, the helmet, the legs, and you're good to go. So I'm going to hit this one a little faster than I would like because we're kind of going over on time now. So this is the, Josh asked if the visors on Grand Bassinets were interchangeable. Yes, very often there were several. Just like the Bassinets, you could actually change the visor out on that too, but we don't have a lot of records of somebody having, as we might have today, a grill and a pig nose and a WMA visor. That's sort of something we're doing today, but they didn't do much of that. But on Great Bassinets, the visors were definitely interchangeable. Now it doesn't, if you want to save, you could actually use the same visor, in tournament and then switch it out for the joust and switch it out again for war. So yeah, you're starting to see that sort of switchability. Now the great competitors to the Italians, because the Italians were the grand corporation, or set of corporations in the 14th or late 14th and into the 15th century. The Italians actually formed modern corporate charters that looked a lot like modern contracts today. And they had the specialization and the vertical integration. So they would buy up the mines, the polishing mills, the platinum, the smelting shops, and then they would have a shop that made nothing but breastplates and a shop that made nothing but helmets and so on. And so when you look at an Italian harness, it might be pieces put together from all over the place. German workshops didn't work that way. They were much smaller in scale, and they tended to work under like a family auspice or a guild auspice. The Italians were guilds too, but they also had corporations. So notice the sharp difference though. This is armor from like 1480, which is right at the end of what we're seeing with Italian stuff. Where the Italian stuff is rounded, this stuff is pointy, and some people have said insect-like. Composed of smaller, lighter plates, by and large, but there are more of them. So the overall weight's not much lighter than the Italian. It's very, very close, in fact, right at 50 pounds, 55 pounds, something like that. For horse and man. Now, a lot of these have had restoration, and they're all composite. There's almost none of these you're going to see that are right off the same harness. So you're going to see a certain amount of mix and match in the Gothic stuff. But things that characterize the Gothic, the breastplate goes together, it's much more fitted, goes together in a much different way. So This is all one piece typically on the breastplate and the folds, and you put the whole front on. Instead of the Italian, you put the top and bottom on, or the top on and then lift up the bottom. In the German, you put the front on and then take the back. So you'll see how that plays out. We'll see some breastplates and stuff here in a bit. Obviously, the pointier pieces, they also had a propensity for, instead of using lames in here, these would be either laced directly to the components or run on internal leathers. So there's no plate-to-plate riveting on these usually. And so they're very flexible and very lightweight. I like to practice in those because they're very protective, but they also don't weigh much. On the other hand, because they're not connected all the way around, they tend to deform easier when they get hit. So 6 of one, half dozen of another. You'll see this pierce work on a lot of Gothic armor, and of course, the famous fluting. This embossing is done to strengthen the lighter plates, the thinner plates, and you do it with, yes, Monty may have, yes, but it depends kind of what you're talking about. He may not have been talking about the armor harness per se, or he might have. Petromonte is a piece from the 1490s that was recently translated by Jeff Forgang, so we have some really good and interesting stuff in there. Good piece though, good bring up, Josh. But I've always felt much more solid in a Milanese set of arms, like it's pretty much bulletproof. That's not the case in the German arms. This whole interior area is a little more open and stuff, and there's not the reinforcing in and around the piece. So you're risking a bit more with a set of German arms, but you get more mobility. That same old trade-off between mobility and protection. Then in the legs here, you'll see all the abundant fluting in here. These cuisses are probably only 60% as thick as their Italian counterparts, but they've got all this embossing to try and strengthen them. The Germans were also doing a two-step heat treating process where you were doing the quenching and then the backing off and tempering. And by the mid-15th century, they had pretty good control over what they were getting for steel because the blast furnace had come into use, particularly in Germany. So the Germans had some really good quality billet steel. The Italians were still wrestling with this. And so their steel was much less even quality. So I think they tended to make up for that with a little bit thicker plates. Now, if you're working in mild steel today, then actually Italian makes more sense because you're not gonna be able to heat treat it. If you're gonna get this effect in Germany, you need to go a little thicker or have it just be very depressible. This stuff would be made out of what we would consider somewhere between 1050 and 1060 today, so 0.5% carbon, and trace elements, of course, the rest being iron. The Milanese stuff was more like 0.2%, which is very much like our mild steel, which is why it probably was a little bit thicker. So here's, whoa. So here's a harness, a famous harness from the Wallace collection in London. This is about 1480, 1490, something like that. You can see that his arms tie together. These glorious pauldrons though, beautiful fluting on them, riveted together in here, typically riveted on the back and leathers on the front, though that's not universal. You can see his Soleil and bever under here. And then you've got the back of the cuirass here is just amazing on this one. In the back, as we'll see in the next frame, the back is a separate piece from the front, not the top and bottom, but back and front. So this piece, there's some restoration work done on this, but it captures at least the tone and flavor of what a fine Gothic harness might have looked like. And then they've got the whole thing for the horse and rider, of course. You're talking of a ducal set of armor here, not Joe Schmo, soldier out in the field. But still some very fine stuff. There is an issue though with this German armor from this period. If you look right here, the Soleil tail kicks up, and yet there's nothing right here. Often that would be covered by a bishop's mantle or a mail collar, covering that zone that you wear under this cuirass. There are some limited references though to guys trying to worry about some kind of plate under there, but we have no surviving examples, and I haven't seen any experiments that really seem to cover it. So if you're gonna go for this style, a bishop's mantle is pretty much necessary to cover this spot. And then you have some exposure on the lower part of the Soleil here, so be careful with these. Make sure you've got coverage all the way up your face if you're doing reenactment fighting of any sort. Here's probably the finest Gothic harness made by Lorenz Helmschmid. Just a stunning piece with all the fleur-de-lis brass edgings and the pierce work and the fluting, just amazing. This is sort of the height of the, well, really it's at the end because we're talking 1490 here, but this is really the last flash of this sort of Gothic style. Long sabatones, you can see that toe piece is removable, so you can have a much shorter sabaton underneath it. There would have been, of course, gloves under the gauntlets sewn in and all of that. And there probably would have been mail here as well, and maybe Bessigew's round little defenses here. It's got the lance rest survives though. That's amazing. That's only true here probably because it's riveted on. And then just the fineness of the work. Now you're getting some guys now that are doing work almost at this level. So we're in sort of at a kind of new renaissance now, which is a particularly cool place to be. But just the particularly fine work on this. Notice the sort of blackish tone here. And that's one way to tell that you're talking about carbon steel, not iron. Iron, typically when you polish it, it's a little more white. This is a little more black, if you can look at the undertone and see that come out. Some of it's the lighting, definitely. Bernadette asks, how does it affect the alla tedesca armor? Well, we'll look at that here in a second. And so we'll get into that in just 1 second. So here's some German gauntlets, both a mitten style. Well, these are both mittens, I guess. These are in the Metropolitan Museum, I believe. No, these are both in the Royal Armories. And typically the leather parts that attach don't survive, but you get the pieces that are riveted together, so there would have been thumb plates and so on. But look at all the bazillion flutes. These are a dream to make, and they weigh almost nothing. Now I've got, sort of pair to look at here. They have a lot of flexibility to them, and they're awesome, though there's nothing on the side. So typically the error in these is these gloves should actually be stitched into the gauntlet. They shouldn't be free floating like this. That's true of any gauntlet, by the way. You want to stitch the cuffs in just for wearability's sake. Oops, we went back one. So typically German gauntlets don't have the back. There are a few where there is a back, but very often there's just the strap. So a little bit strange in the way that they created them. And then a typical German arm harness. This shows one from modern armor broken apart. If you're going to break them apart like this, you want to do something with the eyelets because obviously just the raw steel itself will rub raw. So typically we make a brass eyelet and put it in there. These can be attached with leathers, and this typically attaches to the arming point with leathers too. Pretty simple pair for the modern use, but very practical also. You can lace all these in advance. So you lace this piece here, and you'd lace this piece here, and then you can actually lace this to your arming jacket before you ever put your arming jacket on. Then you got the whole thing on. Now the caveat is if you're going to put on a brigandine or something, that won't work well because you won't be able to get the arms through the armholes of the brigandine. But typically you could lace this all on, and I've got my stuff oriented so I can get it on and off in practice. What I did instead is I put my spalders, the top of these would have spalders attached to them usually. I attach those right to the brigandine, and so I just slide the whole thing on. And then here's the front and back of a typical Gothic harness. Still low scooped here. A Milanese one will typically come up a little higher here. This one though has filled this in. We don't know. Some of these actually, if you look in paintings, they actually look open here. Like there's a triangle here and there's no plate there. So we don't really know what was going on with that. But you can see how all these are riveted here, so it slides. So it'll open and close there. So you can arch your back if you need to. And typically this is a sliding rivet in here, so it'll move a little bit, but not always. Sometimes it's just solid. And if it's solid, you can still fight it just fine. And then these are holes for the lance rest. Notice all three pretty big openings. This is a soldier's sort of gear stuff, but even so, these are up and out because the point of those is to deflect a lance point on its way, or a sword point on its way in. And then here's some reproduction pieces. I put some of these on here for a reason. This Soleil would be one right at 1490, and several of you have been talking about wearing Soleils. This is one way to solve it in that they make it so that the bever is actually riveted to the inside of the helmet here, so it's part of the helmet. You'd lift this bever up and then drop it down, and then the visor goes down. That's not correct for the mid-15th century, but by 1490, there's at least one, I think two, that survive with that. So it's a way to get that look without having the risk of a bever that just flops all over the place. And there are a couple armorers have actually put perf in here so that you can actually have the visor go up and have perf underneath it. So kind of cool. And then some modern some modern German styled breastplates. And then here's the full thing. If you're looking at it today, that's kind of what you'd be looking at. So notice the gauntlets, there's not much under here, but he did actually add a plate here. That's probably because the wearer wanted it, not because they're always like that. And he's got the Bessigew's here that we're missing on the other example. So kind of a nice harness. What questions do we have on German armor? We're almost to the end now. Anything?
Yeah, I got one. I guess I was mistaken, but I thought Bessigew's had kind of gone out of fashion at that point.
For the Italians, yes, not for the Germans. The Germans sort of rediscovered them and threw them back on their harness. So on many Gothic harnesses, you'll see space for a Bessigue there, but you won't see it on Italian armor.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen a couple, Conrad, like that too. He says the Dugongas has mounted his with the up position with the grill under it, a really cool look. Yeah, I've seen some other people do that in the West too, where they actually rivet the grill either under the bever or sometimes they've riveted it to the visor coming down. So you don't actually see it until the visor lifts. That's pretty cool. In fact, one point, one of these guys lifted it up during a bridge battle. Everybody called hold, but he actually, of course, had the bars under it, which freaked out the marshals, but still another way to do it. So yes, there are ways to play with the Soleil. You do have to worry about the lower part of the head. Oops, sorry, it's flopping all over the place here. You do have to worry about this underpiece here coming in, and depending upon the length of your neck, might adjust how much flare you can tolerate in here. I unfortunately have a long neck, so when I put a regular size Soleil on, it's like, oh, look at that, anything can fit in here. So I would tend to have to make mine more like a Soleil, a little longer maybe, just to cover that. That's part of the reason I don't often fight in Soleils. But I do have a Soleil here. Oh no, that's alla tedesca, never mind. So we'll look at that in a second. So BJ asked a question about alla tedesca. Alla tedesca means after the Germans. It's Italian. This is Italian armor. The German armor was so popular and it was competing with the Italian stuff. So the Italians started making armor in the German style. But they didn't copy everything. There's still clearly Italian elements to it. This is the only book I've ever seen on it. In fact, I think this whole alla tedesca thing is something that Dobson has really rediscovered and injected into our scholarship on this. So you can find this one and get it, a PDF of it from Dobson's website. Definitely worth having. And he makes a good case that we can identify alla tedesca armor. And this Soleil here, one of the Royal Armory's ones, is one that he identifies that way. So it's got a one-piece skull, but all this business up here is different than the German one. Look at the German ones, they stop here usually. And so the Italian one has all this extra metal up on it. So it's either alla tedesca, also the Flemish Soleils were probably something like this too. Flemish ones also sometimes had a point up here. And this is what the best that we can really look at in terms of the museum harnesses for alla tedesca. This is, I've forgotten what the accession number is in the Royal Armories, but it's got that same style helmet, a bever underneath. Now they've got their bever tucked underneath the cuirass, which is possible but hard to do. This cuirass is one piece, and it has Bessigues, as you pointed out. Those are the Bessigues when made in Italian shops seem to have been intended for that northern market, for the German market. This pair, I should shut the back. There's a phenomenal set of pauldrons on here that have the most glorious fluting on the back. Unfortunately, like an idiot, I didn't actually shoot them for you. My suspicion is that the rest of these, this is all added on to these nice pauldrons, or at least one of these pauldrons is probably real, the other one might be reproduction. These Bessigues are probably reproduction, but it gives you kind of the look. So you got an Italian style mitten, German construction here. Go ahead, Scott. All right. And you've got sort of a blended shoulders, and you've got kind of a classically Italian leg harness with no saboton. Dobson makes the case, and I think rightly so, that when you see these illustrated in paintings and manuscripts, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at Northern export armor. We used to call Italian export. He's arguing that we should probably call a lot of that stuff alla tedesca because it was done in the German style. And I actually think there's something to be said for that argument. So we see a good example of that illustrated right here in Talhofer, where you can see the elements. It's clearly not really German because it's German here, it attaches here this way, but it's got an Italian style arm harness. And it's got these weird mixed gauntlets. They're not really German, they're sort of mixed German and Italian. It's got the un-German style helmet, but it's got little saboton things, which Italian armor typically doesn't have. And so a mix, and it's possible that they got these things from different places. That is possible. Or it's possible that they're alla tedesca. And this is the harness I had made off of that same idea. Very often the alla tedesca stuff was colored in some fashion, so blackened or blued with gold wash.
The steel's just in the storage area.
And so I had this done pretty much as close as I could get. It's had like 45 pages of documentation. And even then there's some things wrong. The bever doesn't quite sit on the breastplate, so I'm gonna have to remake the bever. That's all right. And I think I may make a new bever for it anyway and put some, do the pierced visor so I can play with it more. Super comfortable though, super light, and very flexible. So I'll probably change the finger plates out. Those aren't quite right. And then I'll have to start, now that I've got access to the shop again, I'll actually have to start making my own again. So piece that I have done in the alla tedesca style. And I think that's what you see in Talhoffer. And then the last style we're going to really briefly look at. Oh, well, I want to show you this first. Here's actually the alla tedesca helmet. Boy. And if you flip it over and look at the lining, this is raised out of one piece. And then the lining is there. You can see the stitching all done and then riveted in with these nice big bold sort of lining rivets. So super comfortable, great helmet. Very pleased to have it. This next slide that you're looking at is Tobias Capwell and his famous $40,000 harness. I don't know if it actually cost that. That's what the rumor was. I haven't actually asked him. I should just ask him sometime. Gorgeous harness. This is done in another style, the English or Flemish styles. They were also extant during the period when the Italians and the Germans were sort of vying for dominance, but they aren't as well known. And this book that Capwell did a couple of years ago, Armour of the English Knight, makes the case that there's a recognizable English style, and that's what he had this harness crafted around. So a cool sort of new thing within the last 10 years, and a handy, nice reproduction of what that might have looked like. So a couple notes I have here. Graz Museum has some really amazing examples. They do, most of the Italian exports in Graz are a little later, but it's a fantastic collection. 16th and 17th century stuff they have is phenomenal, but they do have a few 14th or 15th century pieces in there as well. And then William asks, what's the difficulty starting to make armor? That, William, is unfortunately an entire module and book on its own. So the difficulty is really calibrating the eye, so looking at a lot of medieval pieces, and then learning to make the hammer do what you want it to do. In a nutshell, that's basically what you got to do. And then there was another question up here that I'm scrolling back to. So generally speaking, it's not hard to learn, just tight, time consuming. Yeah, it depends on who you are, I suppose. And we've had a lot of students through the shop that didn't do so well. We've had some other ones who did just magnificently. So there's lots of stuff you can do to start with. It's pretty easy. That's why I did the book. So hopefully you can take a jump start. There's also a ton of websites out there now and some videos you can follow. Okay, so that's all the sections I had on the presentation. So I've got a few minutes left for questions. What questions remain?
So I just wanted to bring up the salad that I'd gotten from Galician.
Sure. Okay, so you did
about the different shapes and such. So you mentioned the spike from the Flemish style.
Yeah.
And padding on it is quite different. I'm gonna unmute I'm gonna mute it so I can show the padding. But it was made with a CS in mind.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yep. You could actually just stitch lower padding on there if you needed to. You don't necessarily have to remove it all.
So with that much padding, it does make it a bit more bulbous, and I found the spike actually keeps the visor from staying up.
Oh, that's a design flaw. Yeah, it should actually go. That depends on the pivot points of the visor, the shape of the visor compared to the bowl shape, which even on bassinets, that can be complicated. Frequently guys don't get it right. But that's a pretty good example of a Flemish thing that he's then, sort of given you the bever idea with a grill. So, and you've got pins there, so you could swap out the visors if you wanted to.
Yeah, I think with the top here, I think you can see how it points up for the visor.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So flattening that out would possibly allow it to hinge up, correct?
Maybe, yeah. Depends on how much the space is. Usually it's more a function of the pivot point, which can't be changed, but hopefully, we'll try it offline. I can take a look at it and see how it goes up. All right, other questions?
So typically on a bassinet or salet or armet, would the the eye holes be sort of in line with your eyes, or would they sit above or below the eyes?
It sits in line with your eyes. However, typically you'd be leaning your head forward a little bit in the saddle. And so they typically line up with that angle. The reason that's true is that you can, at impact or when the arrows come in, change the angle of your head just a slightly and then close off that eye hole. Now, Dom Duarte says don't look away at the point of impact of the joust, but a lot of bassinets are designed specifically so that you can do that. The other thing to keep in mind is that the visors are not typically strapped down. So that visor is going to bounce a little bit. That may be the origin of the term clap visor, because when you have it on horseback and you don't strap it down, assuredly, it makes a clap sound. Dunk, 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 and a little bit of a swishing because you got the male there too. And what most people don't really think about if you haven't done it is that the ocularium is then moving like this. So I actually get that whole space to see out of, not just the little slit. So one of the things we lose by strapping it down is probably the flexibility of the visor.
Yeah, on mine, when I did a demo with Brian Johnson, and I noticed that my ocularia sit a little bit above my eyesight, so I was on foot, having to crane my neck forward, which
sure
didn't seem particularly a good idea with him hitting me around all over.
Yeah, it might be if you're going to fight in foot a lot, it might just change the padding a little bit so it's sat a little bit more level.
Probably what I'll do.
Just pull a little padding out. It sounds like we'll probably do it.
The other thing I noticed is that because you do lose that vision, is that the brief bits of the battle space that you do see, you have to form a mental picture very quickly of what's going on and just guess. You have to do a lot of guesswork on like where the limbs are, where the weapon is coming from. Maybe not so much where the weapon is, because unless they're really generating that full power, they're not getting through it. So you're trying to account for where the limbs are.
Right, or more easily where the body turn is, because from that in the shoulder position, you can pretty well know where the thing is. I fought out of a pig nose for a long time, and I couldn't see anything really below the guy's armpit. So, but I got really good at knowing when it was there, when it wasn't there. Thorvald the Golden in Callantyre won Crown Tournament in a pig nose. So you can certainly do it. It just takes acclimating to, I think. Remember also that if you're doing this in a medieval tournament or something, they also have the same problem. So typically, but that also may say why you want the visor to be quick removal. Now, if you're stuck in a close quarters and you can't see much, maybe you do just lift it up, pull the pin and throw it away. Come back and get it if you survive, or have your squire go get it. That's even better. So I think, that's, having to lock that visor down, we may change a number of things in the way it actually worked. I lock mine down too, but it seems to be they probably thought about it a little bit differently than we do. Other comments or questions?
Nope.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. This will take a while to cook, but I'll put it up as a video once it's done so that other guys can do it. Oh, there's John showing his harness. Good job, John. Thanks.
Actually, I had a question there on that.
Go for it.
When we did this fold, the guy who I sent it to the final attachment put it on the outside of the damn breastplate. I'm going to be removing it. And
why?
Are they documentable that way?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's several in Shurberg that are that way. And in fact, most of now you're doing a little earlier period. So the argument would be, how would they have had it there?
Well, I've changed out the arms too, so I'm wearing more plate. I'm just trying to keep this thing.
Well, if you do it underneath, that requires, making that sort of V-shaped plate all the way around, which is going to be a little challenging. You can do it, but it's hard. You could cheat and do it with leather.
That may be what happens.
Instead of just the outside thing. You might get that same look without half the effort.
Right. I'm doing this on a far more limited shop than a lot of people.
Sure.
What about a detached one that's just worn separately of the breastplate? in that area. You don't have a back plate. It's not like
yeah. Don't think so.
kind of
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence for that.
I
Doesn't mean it's
either.
not there, just haven't seen it.
Right, and I'm trying to be more typical and less of an outlier as I do this. So,
well, you got two options for that era. You could actually go with a scale set of hips. And there's several German effigies with scale hips.
this is towards the
and you
Italian.
Yeah, and you could conceivably, well, that's a German one, but remember that Northern Italian German stuff had a lot of crossover. And then you could also get away with a sort of brigandine approach, less accurate, but much, much cheaper. Or you could put the fold underneath with the leather. So any of those three options will work. And it's not really wildly off if you get on the outside. There are some done that way. So
cool. I'll do a little more looking, and I'll get with you offline on that so that we can.
Yeah, I've got some specific effigies and stuff you can look at. All right, good. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Any other alibis? The last ones?
Nope.
All right, then. It'll take tonight for this thing to cook, probably, assuming it worked. But then I'll post it up on YouTube, and I'll add it onto the list so people can watch it later if they want. Feel free to send me your questions and comments. My intention is to do other classes digging deeper into some other aspects of this stuff. So send me questions about what you might like to see, and we'll do more from there.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you all.
Lunch.
Yeah.
Mahalo, Andrew.